So I am very excited to be here at the first ever SailsConf, and also didn't exactly sleep because I was so excited. Also because I was trying to reconstruct what even happened in the last 10 years, which is actually harder than you would think. Like, a lot's happened, and not just in the framework, but with the JavaScript community and the web development community. So let's just jump right in to the voyage of Sails. This little GitHub Pages site here was the first real web page Sails had, other than its GitHub profile, and the Balderdash website, which was the name of the company, the consulting shop that I was running at the time. This page is pretty basic. I think it's mostly just a get started page. I think we actually launched this page after we had the first Sails video. And what came next, get ready, we replaced these 3 developers in the tub with this squid here, known as Squiddy, holding his little blueprint. And so the web framework of your dreams was actually just verbiage, like design copy, like lorem ipsum text that we kind of just ran with because it was, I don't know, we liked it. And not a lot changed in the next rev. This one you're looking at here was the first time we actually had compiled documentation on the website from GitHub Markdown. Squiddy became a little bit more alert here, got some new accessories, and Sails started getting built by mer people. We also ended up with like a features page and a support page to capture where you can go to talk to the community, which at this time I believe was IRC, since Gitter was not a thing yet. And then this, a few years later, so you can see now we're up to 17,000 stars. This is after Sails 1.0 launched. And this is where a lot of the folks that are relatively new to Sails from the last 2 or 3 years probably, they might recognize this page. And that brings us to today, where Squiddy has finally made it to space. So as we look at this voyage into the history of Sails and where it's headed, there are kind of a few paths we can examine. There's what happened with the project itself, right? Like, it's an open source repo and series of repos, really, and a bunch of different people in the community that are all interested in different things, being driven by different use cases. And then there's also the core team and how they were able to work on this full time, myself included, and kind of who they were over the years. And then there's the element of this, which is just the human reality of being an open source maintainer, and kind of having this land in one's lab. So I'm going to kind of pull from all 3 of these tracks in this conversation. And on the technical side, I'll show you a few early commits and maybe pique your interest a bit. But during the question and answer, let's go into that as much as you want. And for now, I'll keep it kind of high level. It's probably good enough to know that Waterline came at the end of 2012 and associations came at the end of 2013. I don't know if we necessarily need to get into, and that was the commit where this actually happened. Though that can be fun, and we'll see a few things like that. So it all starts with Node.js. So in 2011, I was working in this office in Austin here that was pretty good. It was a good job. It was a startup. I had sort of found my way there. I went to college at UT and met some folks. I was actually an English major for most of the time, and I met some folks that were doing a program called 3-Day Startup. And I didn't know what a startup was, really, but at some point about a year before, I had realized, like, Facebook and apps like it, they must be making money. And I had made like a little music sharing startup, mostly so I could listen to music at home and at work and share the same library. which could have been solved in probably easier ways, but it actually turned out to be pretty similar to what folks like Dalton Caldwell were doing with iMeme and what later became Amazon Music and Google Music. Of course, those were far more sophisticated than my little PHP app, but it whet my appetite, and that's how I ended up getting mixed up with these guys. So I was pretty inexperienced when it came to actually shipping stuff, but I had been programming a lot of my life. So I had a pretty decent handle on, like, you know, if I have the tools and I have some kind of framework. At this time it would have been like Cake PHP or Zend framework or Grails, Groovy on Grails. And so I was in this office, right? They even let me have this tree. And I learned from the CEO of this company about this thing called Node.js. And I watched these videos with Ryan Dahl where he talks about like what Node is and why it's just kind of obviously like a really good thing. And all the performance stuff aside, the non-blocking IO, the whole idea that a network request could take like 10 million times as long as a simple arithmetic operation or like a cache lookup on your or a RAM lookup. Like the thing that really jumped out to me the most was the idea that we would have one single language to rule them all. The idea that I wouldn't have to become a master of PHP and Groovy and Java and JavaScript. That maybe we could just have one language that we all get really good at, and it doesn't have to be a great language, but it would just have to be one language. So I got really excited about Node, and I started to wonder, like, why aren't we using this for everything? Like, you hear about people using Node for kind of high performance situations, and you hear about people using Node for like experimental stuff, you know, light shows, that kind of thing. And there's this sort of gap with like where everything else wasn't using it yet. And I really, I became kind of like fascinated with that gap. And so I started trying to use it at work. If anyone else was trying to do this in 2011, they know how hard that was when the technology was so nascent and there weren't really a lot of great frameworks. Like Express existed, but I think it was like version 2, maybe just barely. And if you wanted to wire it all together, like for me, the impetus was I needed to build some chat features, and that was why Node came up in the first place. Ended up doing PHP polling in practice at work, but meanwhile at home, I was going deep on the Node. So kind of in my spare time, because I was working for a startup, but I always had these little ideas. I was working on this project with this guy, Rishi, and this guy, Sarini, and this other girl, Heather. And we were working on a website to make it easier to do low commitment volunteering. Which turns out was not going to work, wasn't a great idea. We talked to a lot of nonprofits. None of them really had a problem getting and managing volunteers. And definitely not just like raw funnel of volunteers. They needed help with technology in general. Every single nonprofit we talked to was in dire straits when it came to their tools and like their internal software they used. And some of them even directly asked us like, hey, is that something that you can help us with? And that's when I kind of put 2 and 2 together that, you know, I could probably start a consulting business of some kind. If there's this many people that we're just talking to randomly that need work, this could be my ticket to starting my own business. And so I got together with Heather, the designer from 2 Hour Commitment, and we put our heads together on like what kind of business would we create, like what would even be possible in our spare time. And we built these lawyers a website, who is amazing. They trusted us, and it turned out pretty well. It was all built in Node. We even built them a little content management system to be able to kind of what today might be something like Contentful, but obviously way lower fidelity. And we called the company Balderdash, and we founded it that year. And we got like, you know, $3,000 as our first contract, which was enough to have some nice dinners, and that was pretty much it, and just sit in the bank and exist. And we set up a bank account. We did all the things you do. We sponsored a little event during South by Southwest, and luckily made some connections that opened up the door to larger projects. So meanwhile, I'd had this trip planned to India with my friend and roommate Depesh, and so we went to visit his the village where he grew up and some of the other areas. And so it was a 3-week kind of ripping out of reality. And anyways, when I came back to the office, I was pretty dead set on, hey, I want to turn this into more of a thing. I had been automating how I was generating these apps. At that time, it was even WebOS, like Palm devices, Windows Phone, Android, iOS. We were generating cross-platform apps before PhoneGap really had caught on. And, it was proprietary. It wasn't nearly as complete and didn't move as quickly as PhoneGap did as far as adding the native integrations. But it was like, it worked, and it was pretty cool, and it had some features of its own. So anyways, I was spitting out these applications with these scripts that I had written, and really was kind of automating myself out of my day-to-day work. And so I approached my boss and I asked, maybe I could go part-time. And then he said, maybe you could go no time. And that's how I ended up going full-time with Balderdash. Now, luckily, I found myself with a roommate who was working at Starbucks at the time, and we had rented a house that I was planning on covering most of the rent for, with my, albeit, junior level, my developer salary. And so that was a bit of a shock. But luckily we did have the one project, and one thing led to another. And by the time about 9 months had gone by, we had been able to rack up enough kind of projects. We were hitting meetups every week, I think at least 2 times a week, sometimes 3. And then Ben, my roommate, actually just started hitting them way more often than I did, which was really good. And meanwhile, I was working on Sails with an I, not with an E. And if you were to look at like Twitter and you were to search like Sails.js around this time frame, you would see basically nothing. You would see one tweet from the Sails.js Twitter account like in November, and then everything else is about wind in your sails and stuff like that. So I'm going to head over to the commit history, and just to give you a sense of the kind of stuff that was making it in there. This is before we switched from tabs to spaces. So there's like tabs all over the place. I'm still like learning what this stuff even is. JavaScript itself as a language is younger. Younger. Less evolved, let's say. You couldn't really trust for loops always in the same way, or you could, but they just weren't as powerful. This was, I think, underscore before Lodash was really a thing. And a lot of the commit messages, if you look closely at them, are like just a little weird. Like it'll seem like it makes sense at first, like refactored model code to separate data definition language and association stuff from queries, completed caching, and 90% of PHP SDK first pass. So there's some sort of scrambled bits in here from other projects that I was working on, also open source, but this was a piece of the content management system that I was talking about earlier. There was actually a precursor to Parasails, not exactly the same at all. More like a custom rolled backbone-based front-end framework that used to be bundled in the very early versions of Sails that is long gone now. As you can see, it's been long gone for quite some time. And just a lot of kind of commit messages you would expect from someone who was barely hanging on at the time. But we also were able to use Sails at work. So we used it to build a cloud, kind of like a Google Drive or a Dropbox, but that would support OpenStack on your own infrastructure, or you could use S3. had a real-time UI, so if you dragged and dropped a file into a folder, it would show up live, and anyone else that was looking at that folder. All thanks to Socket.io and Guillermo Rauch's amazing work there. And we did a Chrome extension that did some kind of fancy data crunching. Had worked with some great folks on that. Curtis Lacey was one of our first committers, and he was actually the driving force behind Mongo support being added to Sails. If it wasn't for that project, Sails probably would have always just had Sequelize bundled in. And the only reason we even ripped out Sequelize and the only reason I built Waterline was because of this Mongo requirement. Something about Lumberjack, removed cheese, got the JavaScript part working. This is Brad from Tech Pines. Permissions, so there used to be some more built-in permissions in Sails, again, at the very, very beginning, and realized over time it needed to be lighter weight and ripped all that stuff out. On important, really important, breaks things, fix for the fix, etc. So pretty, I was still learning my way around even having public commits. This was like my first open source project. If not for npm publish and how easy it made it to actually put something online, I probably never would have published Sails. I'd kind of had this dream about like, okay, it'll be like, it's kind of like Ruby on Rails, but it's for JavaScript. And you can't call it JavaScript in jails, and you can't call it Node.js on nails, right? So what else are you going to call it? But, you know, that was about as developed as it was early on, as I was trying to make this stuff make sense. And I hadn't really worked on a lot of open source projects before. So you can kind of see in some of these early commits, it starts to get better pretty quickly, just out of necessity. We did get a Fortune 500 client around the end of that summer, which was really lucky because I was having to borrow money for rent. And from Heather's dad, actually. And was able to pay him back, thankfully. But we, there were some tight times, and learned a lot about how bigger companies they're not able to pay as quickly, which is a lesson that no one should forget. So you can see, I'll just flash through these really quick. Happy to talk about any more of these in the question and answer, but you can see controllers are getting automatically like loaded now instead of having to like manually require them. This is actually before the summer. The very first version of the request interpreter for Socket.io, starting to make it less dependent on Sequelize. Really starting to define in April the way that the request interpreter works. So like these things took a few passes of actually using it in real world apps. And it's probably worth taking a step back and just pointing out, I don't think that most of what is in Sails today and the level of effort that went into it from me and some of the early contributors who worked on it, who were working with me at Balderdash, I don't think any of that would have been possible if we hadn't accidentally found ourselves in the situation where we had to like make it be a functional full-time like company, right? They could afford to pay everybody's salary and rent, and also we were already kind of in deep with Node, so it was like we had to finish the job and it had to work. So there were no docs at this point. It was actually Gabe Hernandez dealt with, who, you know, he had just finished school with a physics degree, and we had worked together in a computer lab. He used to sit next to me, and I was kind of like, Gabe, do you want to come show up at my house every day and start working together? And luckily he helped, and yeah, Gabe really endured a lot of the early craziness that existed in Sails, and helped identify like where the problems were as far as developer experience. You can see the beginnings of the asset pipeline develop. Originally, Sails, the repo, wasn't even set up to be like an npm package. It was just like an app, basically. So that changed at some point over the summer. And here's the first real outside contributor commit from Curtis in September. And Curtis went on to add all kinds of cool stuff early on. He was really the first outside person to make a dent in Sails. And I say outside person, just, outside of people that I was paying to make a dent. SSL integration made its way in here. You can see like the methods gradually appearing in the Socket.io interpreter. So, we had like a checklist or like a table, and we like slowly started checking off more and more support for all the rec and res methods over sockets. Session store wasn't initially customizable. It became customizable. There was several iterations of the asset pipeline, and this, even where we're at now with Grunt, almost certainly won't be the last. I realize Grunt is old at this point and not the most ideal experience for a lot of folks, but also it works, and it hasn't been a priority as much as other things to make those work. So happy to talk about that more in questions too. So I'll just kind of like blow through the rest of these. One of the things that here's where we removed Sequelize, different support for view engines. All of this kind of came about in the first year, and it's in its very first version. Control over what globals get exposed. A lot of this was driven by feedback from people in issues and from just folks on customer projects using Sails who were like, what is going on here? And it made it possible for me to jump in and be like, oh, okay, and fix it real quick. Somewhere in here, you'll see that actually I tried to add transaction support like way early on, and like even thought that I had succeeded, and that definitely was not what happened. Like it took several more years before that made its way fully into Sails. The ASCII ship policies started to have to deal with backwards compatibility, started to get more contributions as 2013 drew nearer. And soon there started to be some like just new pull requests and new issues every day from people that I had never met, which I thought was like a fluke at first. So I had made this YouTube video in February of 2013, and within like a day, all of a sudden there started to be all this Twitter activity. And I don't know if YouTube is still this good. From what I've seen, it's maybe not quite as powerful as it was in the recommendation engine, but still a good venue for getting eyeballs. And it made a huge difference as far as awareness of Sails. One day later, all of a sudden there starts to be a bunch of stuff. I remember going into the Google Analytics and just like looking at the real-time count and seeing, hey, there's like 10 people on the site all of a sudden. And lo and behold, like a couple of days later, there's a Reddit thread that's quite popular. And then I think it was 2 weeks later, I think it may have been early March, we ended up on Hacker News. And that was the first time where there was like 100 people on the site at the same time. This, of course, was all happening as for the first time, we'd been scaling up. We'd been able to get enough money to get an office. I had done like my first full-time hire that wasn't just like, hey, you want to come over to my house? And that was Cody, Particle Banana, who went on to become the lead maintainer of Waterline for many years. We started to get some contributions. We had this, we sponsored the same event that we had sponsored last year, and it went pretty well. Like we didn't actually get any deals from the event, but like we met, me and Ben here, we met a reporter, and they like wrote like an article on us, which was crazy. Like I'd never seen anything like that before. Or I certainly never had been a part of anything like that before. The reality, though, is all this is going on, and they're talking about like our framework and what a difference 12 months makes, is that like within the week from here, we have like only $1,000 in the bank, and I am just like desperately trying to learn how to collect invoices and how to be smarter about managing our spending, or rather having a little bit more foresight. which granted I barely even had like a full-time job at this point. So this was all, this was taking like a good half of my time. And then, but boy, it was so exciting that it didn't matter, because this was all brand new, and it was super awesome. But there was a lot of months where I kind of had to like not pay myself until like halfway through the month, unfortunately, or loan the company money rather. And so that was going on, and all of a sudden now we had all this inbound, right? Like we had all of these issues getting created, and we had all these pull requests coming in, and like suddenly something had to give. And what gave is, in some cases, I feel the quality of our client work, which is a regret I have from the time. And we actually were able to, I think we were able to recover that quickly, and we were able to get, recurring business quickly, but we definitely, looking at where we got to as a team in the coming years, it was pretty disappointing, the quality that we were able to deliver in that first year. And I think that open source for us was actually a pretty big distraction, more than at this point it was actually adding value. Later, it would add tremendous value, and it would become a key aspect of us being able to like operate and profitably. But at this point, maybe not so much. Also, at this time, Node did not have support for await, so you were doing everything with callbacks, which, to put it lightly, is difficult for someone who's never done that before. Difficult enough for someone who has, but especially for someone who hasn't. So we did this InfoQ interview. It was like in April. Started getting these emails from people, like professors, like wanted to write like papers on sales, and frankly was just never really sure like how to respond to some of those, and I never did, regrettably, because that would be cool. But there wasn't time, and really appreciated Tim Heckel, who I worked with for this interview, who kind of gave me a platform to position what sales is to business. And I think it helped me start selling a little bit better. Why someone maybe should use Node and use a higher level framework on top of it. Started doing some conferences. Probably was sooner than we needed to. I don't think it really added a ton of value for the company at this time, but learned a ton, and it helped me get to know people in the Node community, which was awesome. Folks like Substack, etc. Not that like I'm close friends with Substack or anything. That'd be awesome, but just getting to know who these people are by a first name basis and seeing their face, or I guess I should say a username basis, it really changed my perspective on like how much I was a part of this Node community. And I think it helped the rest of the team, like Cody and Gabe and Rachel and Heather, kind of feel like we're dealing with actual human beings. And me too, but I mean, just all of us. So here's just some pictures from the time. This is Gabe. That was the guy in my house all the time. This was actually taken, this is Cody, Particle Banana from Waterline. These were taken by Mike Thomas, who's our designer, who did the original Sails logo. There's Scott Gress. From at that time, he had a consulting company called Pig and Cow, so he was helping out kind of part-time through that. And then there's Ben, my roommate. And there's Heather. And there I am. So we had some amazing interns that just came out of the blue, basically, and we're like, hey, we're building a CMS and we want to do it on top of Sails. Awesome people, got to know them. It's on there behind, that's Clara, and that's Hugo, and that's Loic. There's Loic and Rachel from the team. And so anyways, lo and behold, not these exact three people, but the company that what they were working on would eventually morph into was actually Strappy, which recently, I guess like a year ago, just raised $10 million. And, no longer is built on the same stack at all, but just interesting that it worked out the way that it did. And it was cool to meet them. And they also added a lot of value and helped us out with some projects. And then we got our first kind of negative article, which luckily was not very negative, and like pretty much everything in it was fair. But it was a taste of what would come as the open source community grew and our exposure to a wider audience grew. And different demands, different people's expectations. You see there's the team. I think you've seen some of these people before, but there's Earl, Nathan, who you might have seen before on GitHub. That's Luke Heath there behind Heather. And there is Nick Crumrine and Courtney. I think that's everybody. I think I'm wearing the hat. Quite a few of those. And there's Scott Gress in his high heels and ping pong paddle. So we did a bunch of these events. I'll blow through these. South by Southwest Interactive. We did DevOps Days. There's Gabe in the airport. We traveled to speak quite a bit because we would get inbound opportunities to talk where they would cover the flight, which was awesome. Generally, that wasn't part of the offer. It was kind of like, you have to fly here. And then it was like, well, it depends how much money we have right now. And yeah, it sort of, I would say probably half the time we had travel taken care of, and half the time we didn't. The actual going to these talks probably made very little difference in the raw numbers. I was never really able to see a huge difference in our analytics or like our followers or stars or anything like that. We weren't really pushing so much for increasing those numbers as much as we were just trying to like get time with people to say, hey, this is Sails. What do you think? Is this working for you? And to kind of evangelize, hey, we think that there should be a way to use Node.js for everything. Got an opportunity to fly to Italy. That was super awesome. Got to talk about just kind of introducing Sails. And eventually all of this like turned into the coolest speaking opportunity I've probably ever done, which is going to Paris and speaking at this thing called Node.js. Which is this beautiful theater. Like, frankly, I was like so intimidated. There was like JD from Lodash was there, and like Paul O'Shaughnessy from React was there, and a lot of other amazing people. So I was just like, whoa, this is so cool. I don't even know what to say to you guys, because y'all are like my heroes. If Ryan Dahl would have been there, that would have been like the best, but that's okay. So anyways, that was a really cool experience, and kind of like a turning point for me as far as where it's like, okay, Sails is turning into something that has gotten bigger than I know what to do with, right? And we needed to have like some more processes and stuff. And so meanwhile, I even got to go to the Louvre. So meanwhile, I'd been working on this idea with some other folks from the Sails core team. And the idea was like, what if we took these adapters that we use in the ORM? Like normally maybe you have, you do like user.create and that like writes to MySQL, right? And we had tried this like, okay, what if like tweet.create would actually write to Twitter? And that turned out like just didn't make a ton of sense in practice. But what came out of it was this sort of realization that I think a lot of more mature developers would have already understood in a different way, which was like, hey, there's these interfaces that we can exploit in order to make code swappable. And then we were like, so what if we did that, but we made the interface drag and drop, and like all of the insides were swappable. So that was captivating me, and I think gradually started as it started to come together and make more sense. It was something where we all started to be like, okay, this could be cool. This is going to be a lot of work. So this was kind of the first step, this Node Machine project thing. It was a way of, and continues to be, it's changed forms a little bit. But this is, it's a way of having a standard interface for JavaScript functions, basically. And this is what became helpers in Sails, scripts in Sails, and actions too in Sails. Anything where it's like inputs, exits, or the equivalent, because you don't actually have to write inputs and exits anymore. But so that led us to apply to Y Combinator. And it was me and Cody and Scott and Earl. And we flew out to California. We almost missed the flight. As part of this process, we decided to wind down Balderdash. So Heather went and started this company called C Lab, which is her design agency that she still runs today. She's done all kinds of amazing projects, and is pretty much, if you're looking to get something done soup to nuts, as far as let's figure out how this needs to look and get it there, they're awesome for that. So highly recommended. So that kind of allowed us to be like, okay, cool, Balderdash is on ice. We're still getting these leads to the contact form, but let's just go for it. So we show up to California and we do a 10-minute interview. It's super short, super intimidating. We get out of there, we go to this bar, and we just nervously sit at this table, and then they call us and we go outside, we put it on speakerphone, and they're like, you're accepted. So we're like, okay, I guess we're going to pack up and move to California for 3 or 4 months. So we did. And that was an incredible experience that I won't go as deeply into here just because of time. The standout parts was, we got a ton of focused time living together in this sort of Fight Club-esque house that was actually demolished after we left, because it was relatively cheap rent for California, in Los Altos near Mountain View. Growing up in Texas, amazing to be just near in the California climate, which was just it made the whole thing sort of ethereal and amazing. And met some really amazing people, like the guy who created Gmail, or who kind of drove I think a lot of people got their hands in it, but the guy who sort of oversaw and directed it. Got to meet the guy behind iMeme, which is actually kind of related to that first music startup I was talking about before. And then also got to meet Paul Graham and Jessica Livingston, both of whom are absolute inspirations. And Paul Graham told me I had spider fingers. So there's that. So anyways, we actually were pretty well received as we started to kind of evangelize this Treeline idea. And meanwhile, we were still working on sales, and Treeline, it spits out sales apps. So it was we were shifting, all of a sudden we were a product company that was using and maintaining sales. And it felt a lot like the transition from, 37 signals to Basecamp and what they did with Ruby on Rails. And I think that's how I was seeing it at the time. Definitely overlooked some complexities that they're involved in making that switch. But all in all, the YC experience was great. We had a lot. I think it was great for sales and it was great for Treeline. So anyways, we found out that okay, apparently at the end of YC, it's not just they give you the money and take part of your company. Everybody goes and raises money, more money, to be able to continue working and not just go back to doing client work, because most of the companies there were not already doing client work. So we did that because everyone else was doing it, and I didn't know anything about fundraising, but they help teach you, and I learned and screwed up royally a few times in my pitches, but eventually I had this 1.5-minute thing that was awesome. We had a lot of investor day, or a lot of demo day interest from investors, and then we were on TechCrunch's top 10 list of startups, which was super awesome. And Chariot, they got acquired by Ford, I think, or they merged with Ford or something. And there was so many amazing companies in our batch. GitLab was in our batch, Platzi was in our batch. So we get done with this, right? And we raise the money. We meet Platzi along the way, who was kind of in our group, and that was a super useful experience. We were one of the most visited and popular courses on Platzi in the English language for a while, and then meanwhile, Platzi kind of helped us have a tutorial that we just never would have made the time to create otherwise, and we didn't really have the video capturing and recording skills to do it, and we just wouldn't have spent the money. So it sort of like accelerated our legitimacy there as far as how quickly someone could get up to speed with using Sails without having to like read all the docs. Taught a course with them, went to their conference, got a chance to really talk about Treeline for the first time now that I understood it better and like what it actually meant, like what it was doing. And then got to meet folks from the Platzi community who had learned about Sails that way, which was super cool. So like all of these folks were new to Node, usually not new to JavaScript because they had some front end chops, but had basically learned back-end development for the first time through Sails, which I was just like so excited about because I love teaching people and helping people learn. Probably got a little caught up in it, honestly, but it was really awesome, really motivating. So anyways, I come back and I'm like, I'm in Austin with Scott and Cody and Earl. Meanwhile, Sails is growing. It's not exponential growth, but like the amount of fresh interest coming to the website is steady. And then there's articles being created that we are just not even aware of anymore. We stopped paying attention. And then meanwhile, we have this like beta sign up, right, for Treeline. And so now we're building the Treeline product. We're continuing to build and maintain Sails, which luckily we'd kind of gotten associations done at this point, which was the biggest to-do for us for a while. At this point, we still didn't have transactions yet, and there was still a lot of kind of hardening we hadn't gotten to in terms of performance and all of the stuff that you run into when you maintain an app and grow an app with a lot of traffic for maybe like a year as opposed to like 6 months. So we start getting all of these tweets from people like, hey, I want to join the Treeline beta. And we're like, I don't know if we can really let you in because it's not really ready. And then meanwhile, there starts to be all just piling on of distractions, right? So we start to see like more negative articles, again, like mostly pretty legitimate. I think Ship had some difficulties with Sails, like the same kind of difficulties that anyone would. And it didn't matter anymore that Sails was the best option like it for Node, because our users now, because of kind of the halo of Y Combinator and the halo of like TechCrunch and everything, we're seeing Sails as like, okay, that's like a legitimate choice compared to Django or Ruby on Rails. And I think they weren't expecting like, you might have to kind of, it's still pretty early. So on the bright side, that it allowed us to fix these things. So even just stuff as simple as like breaking links to the docs, like we were just moving docs around all over the place, and we weren't maintaining permalinks. So all of these people creating articles, of which at this point there's bajillions of them, the links were just breaking, and like people were complaining, and understandably were like frustrated. Plus there was some all kinds of legitimate bugs that came out of these kind of articles and reports. So we started fixing those, and at this point, like it's, there's starting to be a tide of folks who've had, tried Sails, not had a great first experience for what they were trying to do and for their set of expectations, like specifically folks from outside of the Node community. And sometimes from within, but usually from outside. And they would understandably, not be super willing to try again. So luckily, a lot of people did, and I think that, as we'll get to in a second, that it eventually mostly worked itself out. But this was a period of time where it was pretty polarizing. There were some pro Sails people and plenty of anti-Sails people out there. Then we had some concerns about the velocity, right? Because as far as like how fast we were shipping bug fixes and being responsive to issues and stuff, like that had dropped way down because now we were dealing with like more PR, like public relations kind of stuff, because there would be like a Reddit thread that was just trashing Sails, and we would want to go in and on one hand know what was being said, but also on the other hand, we wanted to like fix it, whatever the problem was. So we were kind of hyped up monitoring that stuff. And a lot of the time we would just have to let things slip. And meanwhile, the latest hacker house here back in Austin was having a flea infestation. So things sort of culminated in me wearing these like white dance tights around the house every day and sort of like sitting in my chair on my knees. And not everybody not coming over as often anymore until we finally moved out of that house. And meanwhile, the beta invites just kept coming in. So on the bright side, Treeline itself was like, it was getting tight. So this was, started to become a lot more complicated than we thought as far as specifically the UI and what needed to be included to like really represent everything you could do in code. It wasn't the dragging and the dropping of the parts, like moving around instructions in a function. It was more about like in code you can leave a comment, right? In code there's a way of writing a function signature. So we kind of had to like make all of that work and then make that work with type safety. So without getting too deep into it, that took a lot of time, but that was definitely where our focus was because that's what we had raised money to do. And that was, our duty to our investors and to the people who believed in us, along with maintaining sales. But as far as new dev, that was the focus. But meanwhile, we kept getting more and more invite requests. And we had this book that I had agreed to write with Earl before we actually started YC or before we had even applied. And, and we'd made some good progress, but it needed to be finished. So on one hand, it was good that we were able to release a book. On the other hand, it was another distraction. We were tweeting out all these Sails.js jobs, which was ironic because at this point we were starting to run out of money. And we recorded a new course. So this was towards the end of 2016. We were starting to realize like, okay, we have like maybe 6 months left of runway. We've already cut our salaries as low as they can go. We're cheap to begin with. And like, basically I literally couldn't pay rent if we cut it anymore. And so we started to realize, okay, let's focus on sales. Let's figure out how other open source projects like make money and try to do that instead of going back to doing a shop, like running professional services and helping people build custom apps, right? Because that's super distracting. And we learned that before trying to build Treeline in between projects. So I'll come back to Ration. So we built this thing called Sales Flagship, which is basically just a support portal. And in some ways this works and continues to work today. Like you pay with your credit card. We have customers on there and it's good. We answer questions. It's just even at $600 a month, which is a lot. If you're, a small business, it's significant. And if you're, we've had publicly traded companies buy this. We've had individuals buy it for 1 month, in combination of both. But it's been an important part of funding our ongoing costs and like some amount of the work of sales, but it's never been something that can really pay for even one person's full-time salary, even at like minimum wage, really. So don't see this and think like, hey, that business model works, because really it doesn't, as far as providing enough revenue, at least with the scale sales was at, which was pretty significant. Like there was enough eyeballs and enough real world users of Sails. The problem is getting people to charge $600 to a credit card is a big ask, and we weren't offering anything tangible enough in return that someone could point to and say, hey, let's run that up through procurement. So we went back to being a shop with no other choice left, basically. So we restarted the company, or we used the same corporate entity, right? And sent an email out to our investors. And I said,
what was up, which was we have $2,000 in the bank and we've cut our burn as low as it can go, and we have nothing. Right now. But we managed to close, 31K in deals. It's non-recurring revenue, and our investors were super cool about this. And it's also, the reality is, in the meantime, Sails was getting downloaded like crazy. All these other open source packages we have are getting downloaded like crazy. People are contributing to Treeline and these parts that you can drag and drop around. Not that we have time to work on Treeline at all, right, at this point. And so then we either shut down the company or we keep it going. And from the beginning, before we'd ever raised capital, I had always been insistent, like, we're going to keep this going. Like, this moving to being a product company it's a step away, but it's part of the same trajectory that we're on to make Sails.js be the best possible framework we can for our use cases that we have, and that we hear from the community. But prioritizing what we actually have to get done, right? So that was hard, as you might expect, but we got through it. Cody ended up leaving because someone had to, and he was, I think he was the most down to leave behind professional services for a while, and he ended up in a great situation at Knock as the director of engineering. So that left us with the question of, okay, how can we do this smarter than last time? Last time we were making maybe $700,000 a year in revenue, and we were burning like $680,000 a year, right? So it was plenty of revenue coming through the door, but it wasn't recurring, and we had to work super hard for it. That's true in services in general, but this time we did something different, which was seizing on something that I had been doing for the better part of the last 10 years, which is teaching people to code kind of for fun. And so we built this apprentice program where people could go start with, basically no coding knowledge at all, and just grit and desire, and work for 2 years, learn to code, learn to build front end first, HTML, CSS, learn how to do QA, learn how to do customer support, do Sails.js support, right? Respond to issues. We started to have a more firm triage process now that we had people that could staff it. The apprentices learn, and you get the work at a rate that is like achievable, right? For where we were at. So it was like, work 32 hours a week on client work and make that absolutely apparent in the contract. And then the rest of the time was spent maintaining our open source tools, and checking like internal, Slack messages from the team and stuff like that. And it worked. So we were able to build the team back up. We were never as big of a services business as we were before, but it became a thing, and we were able to survive for, I think, 5 years after that point, just doing that. That allowed us to get the one extra year we needed to actually get Sails 1.0 into the ship shape that it needed to be in to call it done. And we shipped it. Sails continued growing as far as stars. It continued growing as far as downloads, even in 2020, which was otherwise a pretty rough year for us, like it was for a lot of people. Actually, it was the best year ever for Sails. And but 2020 had its challenges. And after a good extra 5 years of doing services or whatever, or 4 years, it was time to wrap that up. So when we graduated, all but one of our apprentices, we changed course, and that kind of brings us to where I'm at today, which is I am the CEO of Fleet, which is a startup building open source device management. It's part of the vision that eventually most software will be open source, and a lot of it already is, or soon will be. So device management is like if you've got 10,000, 50,000 laptops and servers, you want to be able to get an agent installed on all of them, make sure they don't have any viruses, and then also, make sure that your standards as far as like is screen lock enabled, is the hard disk encrypted, that kind of stuff are all going. And yeah, so Fleet was actually created by this fella named Zach Wasserman. And so Zach also created OS Query, which is actually a lot like Waterline in that it's like SQLite, the database, but with the guts ripped out. And instead of talking to like a storage layer, it's actually talking to a device. So really, really similar to what, long ago in Sails we were trying to do with like tweet.create and talking to the Twitter API. So I got super interested in this project, right? And yeah, basically Zach talked me into it. So I joined the team and we use Sails. So at Fleet, our website is in Sails. The actual Fleet product is written in Go because it's a 4-year-old, I think 3 or 4-year-old product at this point. It's in good shape, it's stable. Never would try to rewrite something that's working, right? And and it's good. And there's a lot of contributors that also know Go, and it's a good ecosystem, and it's cool to finally be a part of it. At the same time, we also use Sails, right? And so we use Sails for our website. You can it's all open source. So if you ever want to see how documentation gets compiled, very, very similar to what's on the Sails website, you can check out fleetdm/fleet on GitHub and the website folder, which you'll recognize the folder structure. Yeah, and I'll move quickly through this because no need to dwell. But there's been this recurring theme, right, over the past since 2014. With people asking, is insert name of open source project here dead or dying? And the answer is like always no and yes. I mean, every project is only as sustainable as the willpower of the person that's going to be maintaining it, or their willingness to kick that to someone else, or its ability to get funding. In Sails' case, I have the deep, deep interest in continuing to have it exist for my own use at the absolute least. Not to mention that it's being used in Fleet, not to mention that a lot of the people that I know in my network and in my life use Sails and prefer to use Sails. So I guess what I'm saying is Sails is not dead. Sails is not dying, and it's going to be very, very hard to get rid of it. The same thing happens to Laravel. You can see just this kind of like back and forth. This is 5 years ago. Is Laravel losing the battle to Sails and Express? Then just a little bit later, or maybe earlier, I think actually, is Sails dying? Is Express dead now, right? 5 years ago. What happened to Sails.js 4 years ago? Even as recently as last night, someone asked, is Sails.js dead? Not picking on any of these folks. It's reasonable, right? Like, people don't know what level of activity to expect, right? And if they see maybe the last commit was last week, like, when Sails was brand new, there were commits almost hourly from usually from me or from somebody in the team or in the community. And, when something's more stable, that's no longer really necessary. So anyways, hopefully it's very clear that that's not the case. You're at SailsConf. It just started, and this is super exciting to get to see so many other folks who are using or have used very recently Sails in their lives for work. So I'll just call out, if you want to, get a sense of some of who these people are that I've been talking about in this talk and put faces to names, check out the contributors on GitHub. And then you can always drop in live chat and Gitter. There's an active Stack Overflow tag with like 6,500 questions. You see the most recent was from 2 days ago. Before that, June 17th. Same kind of thing going on in Gitter. Sails is very active. There's a community of folks out there, and not everybody knows the answers always, of course, but there is someone else out there who has probably had your problem before, or at least it might have the same use case. And when and if that doesn't work, Eric Shaw is our community manager. And once a week, I meet with him and Rachel, and we look at all of the new inbound that we received, and we triage all of it every single week, or within what we can do as far as time, which is about an hour or an hour and a half. And sometimes it rolls over. I would say like at least half the time we get through all of it or catch up. It's gotten easier and easier to do that as sales has become more and more mature. And then Rachel is our lead maintainer. She takes care of security vulnerabilities, any bug fixes, any improvements that are going to get merged. And I am our creator and benevolent dictator for life, and I will always be here for sales, as long as Node.js is the thing that we can all still use. This is going to be the way that I use it, and I hope that it'll be there for you too. And I'll just finish up with even with those options, like you're not alone still. There's a lot of amazing companies that use Sails in production, and some of whom you're going to hear from today. Ankit at Postman, Ezra at Paystack, Anadita at Amazon. And I think at least 4 other talks from some people I've met before and some that I haven't, including Christian from Platzi. So super excited about the rest of the conference, and so glad that you were all able to join us. This is my favorite crowd to talk to. Thank you.